Okay. David, it's all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jose. Thank you for the warm welcome. I thought it was a nice save there when you said that sometimes the contents were almost as interesting as the title. I picked up on that, don't worry. So my talk tonight is Be More Mushroom. This is one of those ones where I'd sort of like to get through the body and then we'll follow some questions at the end. There will definitely be time for that, although I haven't actually timed the talk, but I think there's some bits that I can skip around, so that's fine. So I want to talk this evening possibly about the main problem facing firms, which is survival in a world of unending change. I want to tell you some stories. The stories are going to have mushrooms, plasma, and drums, and they're going to be about time, process, organization, and philosophy. But before we get onto that, let's start with a question. So this is an interactive question. Feel free to type some answers into the chat. Does anybody recognize this? Okay, you can use the reactions, actually. That works pretty well. Yeah, Spotify model, spot on. Any problems you can think of with the Spotify model? So I'll explain it in a second for anybody who doesn't recognize it. In fact, I'll explain it now whilst people start typing in some comments on it. So the Spotify model was developed by Spotify in 2012, as it conveniently says on the slide. And they say this is what we were doing at a particular point in time. And so what they're describing there is tribes. They're describing individual teams on these sort of verticals. Chapters, they've got guilds, which are inter-team, and squads. It's a particular model of doing matrix management. Okay, so as many people have said here, first of all, we're not Spotify. Secondly, Tim mentions it's not a model. Correct, it's not a model. It's just a snapshot of what they were doing in the time. Too many people want to record it. Yep, still not a model. Not even Spotify used it. Yes, it was just a small part of Spotify. Exactly. This is a huge problem. In fact, arguably, and by the way, when I see the Spotify model, I always want to sigh. Somebody says, oh, we should use the Spotify model. And I'm a bit like, oh, really? But the bit that's always missing, has come up from people's comments, is in the article in which they introduced it to the world, they said Spotify is, like any good agile company, evolving fast. This article is only a snapshot of our current way of working, a journey in progress, not a journey completed. By the time you read this, things have already changed. I would argue that's slightly wrong. I would argue they should have written, by the time it was written, it had changed. But what this does illustrate quite nicely is that humans tend to take the moment of an organization, commit it to paper, create patterns and schemas, and then apply them to other places. What is this? Comments in the chat. What was this? What is this? And what was this? Yeah, I mean, the entire model is amusing on sort of a meta level, I completely agree. So Tim says a transformation. Metamorphosis, yep. What is the creature? What was the creature? It depends. That is such an agile answer that you should be disqualified. Caterpillar to butterfly, absolutely. All right, it's a butterfly caterpillar. They're the same creature, just slightly reorganized, right? The problem is, when we look at these slides, I wish I'd used the very hungry caterpillar now, because obviously that would have been brilliant. When we look at models like this, what we actually do is we think about change in a very linear way. So in fact, what we're looking at here from our perspective is there are 5 snapshots that represent the same thing at 5 different points in time. There's 5 discrete items. Here we've got a pupa, it's starting to emerge, and we've got eventually complete emergence. So these are discrete items as we see them. They're discrete points in space-time, and we can't actually see the movement between them. Change is viewed as what it is at a given moment, and that's not how change works. How can I explain this better? If you want to create a butterfly, you must first create a universe. It started off with an explosion of undifferentiated plasma, absolute consistency, absolute chaos, no order at all. After a few seconds, it started to get eddies and walls, and those interacted, and the plasma started bashing into each other and creating matter, created hydrogen, deuterium, and tritium, all of which are types of hydrogen. And then 2 deuterium atoms smash together, and suddenly you've got helium. And then you get a helium and a tritium smashed together, and you've got lithium, and 2 heliums bashed together, and you've got beryllium. That was all in 20 minutes, and then it got too cold for any more of those reactions. This was the first diastole, the first expansion of the universe. This is inorganic organization. Once, our butterfly was nothing but a cloud of very hot quarks. Sometime later, hydrogen and helium decided they wanted to get together a bit more. They started to contract to form stars. This is the first systole. We have a star being born. But early stars burnt through their fuel very, very quickly. We have another diastole, another expansion. We've got runaway fusion happening, creating a supernova. But supernovas are massively creative. They're creating carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, most of the elements up to and including rubidium, including iron and silicon. Other elements come from low mass stars. That's carbon and nitrogen. And exploding white dwarfs and merging neutron stars produce pretty much everything else in the universe. Elements born in the death of stars. All the right elements for a butterfly, not necessarily in the right order. We have another period of contraction. All of the elements thrown off by the exploding star contract, and they start to accrete around a star. So that's a new star right in the center there. And this is a planetary accretion disk. So the elements start to clump together and form dust. And then the dust clumps together around the new star. More clumps stick together to create bigger clumps. And eventually you get enough clumps to create a planet. They're drawn together. It's another contraction. In fact, just here, this ring here, there is almost certainly a star of some sort forming there. Sorry, not a star, a planet of some sort forming there. This is an actual photo, by the way, or actual photo. So we get planets. They're hot when they first come together. Some are mostly gas. Look at Uranus and Jupiter. Some are quite heavy and rocky. Some have got water. But this still isn't quite enough for a butterfly. We need another innovation. And so on a wet one out in an unimportant arm of an average galaxy, something exciting happened. Instead of just inorganic organization, now we have organic organization. Carbon-based chemical reactions create simple cells, which are able to reproduce themselves. Change in this new organic organization is flamboyant. Experiments are rapid. Content and expression for the first time are separated onto different layers. Content is managed by DNA and RNA, and life is the expression of that content. And this allows for the first time the content to be modified very, very rapidly, sort of a form of prototyping. This is not an actual photograph. So what life does, what the organic organization system does, is it tries out some options, sees what works. It uses probe head experimentation. And again, we have this pattern of systole and diastole. The expansion, rapid DNA mutation, allows it to try different life forms very, very quickly. But then we've got a contraction, natural and ecological selection. Constant systole and diastole, contraction and expansion, happens as a result of environmental disasters, as a result of mass die-offs, as a result of whatever's coming next. So now we've gotten from a stream of quarks to dinosaurs. Can we experience that rhythm of expansion and contraction even faster than in organic life? This is a nightingale. Nightingales are known for one thing: birdsong. It's the very famous first BBC radio transmission was of a nightingale singing. But birdsong, particularly nightingales, isn't genetic or instinctive. It's regional, it's cultural and social. Art doesn't wait for humans to begin. These birds were moulding the way they express themselves before humans came along. And we can call this the alloplastic organizational structure. That means it's being moulding, it is moulding and being moulded by external factors. For example, in Central Park, not in Perk, the cafe, Central Park, there are several flocks of birds of the same species who all have different accents and dialects. So now the stream of plasma is having literal ideas. It's culture, it's just not human culture. It's organization at the level of symbols. The content is the collective mind of species, and the expression is in individual and group behaviors. Of course, us humans have taken this to the next level. We have more expansion, empires rise, religions gain influence, cultures grow, cities are built. And then we have more contraction. The empires are replaced by the next big civilization. Some religions die out, some change. Cultures are absorbed, cities are reclaimed. We'll come back to Ho-to-Wan later. Humans call it culture and society, but like I say, it's not just human. The alloplastic speed is super fast, okay? Symbols can change and modify rapidly, and it's expressed by collective behaviors responding to symbols, and it allows very rapid experimentation and change. In short, change is all around us. Change is pretty much what the cosmos does. So back to our butterfly. I asked two questions: what is this and what was this? They were the wrong questions. Instead of looking at what it is and what it was, instead of thinking about what it is as a series of snapshots, what we could call being, a better question is, what is it becoming? This one is clearly becoming butterfly. Perhaps shortly after that, it's becoming parent, passing on the content of the DNA, but in a new form of expression, a different caterpillar, a different butterfly. We have a becoming metaphor for this butterfly tonight. I mean, butterflies aren't particularly alloplastic, but here we are using the butterfly to talk about a big idea. So we've actually put the butterfly into our own alloplastic layer of organization. And then what? Maybe physically it becomes soil. It provides nutrients to a tree or another animal. It becomes the future. It becomes everything. So perhaps becoming is a different, perhaps a better perspective on Spotify. It was a snapshot. Anything that was learned here was contextually dependent. If the configuration changes, then the truth of this model changes. So the trick here is thinking less about being and more about becoming. Becoming realism is what we might call this. So becoming realism is a form of philosophy, and it's about how we think about what the world really is. And becoming realism is processual. Nomadic science is another example of being processual and thinking about becoming. Nomadic science is about knowledge and ways of knowing. And it starts with a guy called Heraclitus of Elia, about 600 years before Christ was born. Alfred North Whitehead in the early 20th century rediscovered this. And in both cases, they are giving primacy to the becoming of things. I'll talk about the flip side of that in a second. How an entity becomes constitutes what the actual entity is. So the two descriptions of an actual entity are not independent. Its being is constituted by its becoming. Instead of thinking about nomads necessarily as being like the Berbers pictured here, we can think of it as the Greek term nomos, being behaviors and laws that are customary and habitual. Another example would be stonemasons, who in the medieval period carried knowledge and skills between sites to create cathedrals, monasteries, and castles. What these nomads do and what this knowledge does is it collects these sites and communities and ideas and practices and languages. It's characterized as learning by doing rather than learned by books. We still see this nomadic science today. Doctor's bedside manner. Why can't that be taught in a university? Psychedelic therapies. They're just starting to be brought into legitimacy, but they were very much outside of that realm beforehand. Nomadism is like a rhizome. You might not have heard of rhizomes before unless you're a keen botanist, but you are definitely familiar with them. So ginger is the classic rhizome. This is an iris in the photograph. And mushrooms. You'll be shocked to learn that mushrooms have turned up finally in this presentation. Rhizomes usually grow underground, although actually the iris, conveniently for photographic purposes, grows above ground. And they're characterized by growing laterally outwards instead of depthwards. They're more random than roots, and they tend to have lots of short segments which change direction quite a lot. And if you've ever seen ginger, you'll know that. They're incredibly hard to kill. A tiniest fragment left of the rhizome will result in new plants. And if anybody's ever had to deal with an infestation of Japanese knotweed, you will know that. All parts of the rhizome are what we might call multiplicities. They can be a root, they can provide storage, or they can become a tree. They don't have a fixed point. They are where they are. And any point of a rhizome can be connected to anything other and must be. Rhizomes, like nomads, make connections. Organic organization and experiments by the probe head, that's basically what the rhizome does. It sends out the head, it experiments, it finds out if that new environment is perfect for it or not. This is meant to be Isaac Newton, by the way. We can have an argument about how realistic the illustration is later. The flip side of this becoming realism, this nomadism and this rhizomatism, is being realism. So this is a form of philosophy that started 100 years after Heraclitus, so about 500 years BCE. And it starts with a bloke called Parmenides. And he says, everything is a separate and identifiable thing, locatable at a specific point in space-time. You can think of an arrow flying through space. It always occupies the exact space of the arrow, and it's always at a particular point in a particular time. This is what's called an ontology of substance. Everything that is real derives from one thing. We can think about that one thing perhaps as being quarks. And then everything else is a hierarchy, an organization chart of reality. Okay. We often think of Plato when we think of this. So we think about, we can't know what the thing Okay, so imagine we're in a cave. Behind us, there is a fire. We're chained up and we can only face the wall. And all we can see is the shadows cast on the wall by the fire. And of course, the wall isn't even and the fire isn't solid. So whatever walks past, all we can do is work it out by looking at those shadows. And he says that's what knowing what a chair is like, for example. Okay, so there is this reality of a chair, and below that are all of the imperfect reflections of what a chair is. This model of reality worked for Newton, hence Newton. It allows a mechanical view of the universe. This has got huge benefits. Modern science, all numbers, right? We can reduce most of science to numbers, and it's all fixed. It has a standardized way of working. It also creates a hierarchy of knowledge. Physics is scientific, and it's truthier than psychology or sociology. Everything becomes a hierarchy in a being realism system. Deleuze and Guattari, who are two 1960s philosophers, call this royal science. It's the science of the city. Cities are connected. They're formed of numbers, house numbers, telephone numbers, street numbers, lamppost numbers. They're safe, they're understood, they're fixed in place, they're sedentary, unlike the rhizome. We can describe this behavior as being striated. And by striated, we just mean it's got lines drawn on it. The connections are ready-made. Maps fix locations, everything has coordinates. The royal science enables this rigidity. Royal science is approved by the state. That's why we have doctors and chemists and biologists who have done approved courses and have learned to work in certain ways. The city has a rhythm. The rhythm is fixed from its center and everything beats in its time. I mean, there could be an argument about what that time is, but banking hours is a pretty good example. The city also has hierarchies marked out in those same striations. Royal science is arborescent. It's like trees, woody, fixed, flexible enough to withstand heavy winds and earthquakes. It has bark as a territorial defense, much as wolves have their territorial defenses. It has a single trunk and a point of origin, which if you slice it, will kill the tree. It is hierarchical, both above ground with the branches and below ground with the roots. It tames the territory around it. Everything is relative to the tree. Everything is striated by the tree. This is Pando, the trembling giant of the Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. It's the world's largest living organism, and it is a male quaking aspen. It covers 108 acres. It weighs about 6,000 metric tons, and it's probably about 1 million years old. It's a single rhizome. But as you can see, it needs to photosynthesize, so it sends up trees. There's a key point here that although I'm sort of talking about rhizomes and trees and nomads and cities as though they're separate things, of course, they coexist. Trees need rhizomes for signaling, and in fact, they often use mushrooms in the mycorrhizal layer, and they also need rhizomes as a way of reproducing. You'll never find a pure tree or a pure rhizome. They are necessarily coexistent. Now, some of you are going, this is all very nice, David, but so what? Who recognises this? Anybody? Please tell me somebody recognises this, because this is going to be a very weird talk and I completely misguessed the audience. The Agile Manifesto, in my opinion, is processual thinking. It is a becoming realism. It is not a being realism. It says in the opening sentence, we are in the process of uncovering better ways. We are in the process of doing it. We are in the process of helping others. But hold on a second, doesn't the first value statement say processes are less important? What it actually says is that connections between people and things are more important than fixed and unchanging processes and tools. When I'm talking about process thinking here, I'm not thinking about flowchart thinking. I'm thinking about ignoring the idea that there are separate states and that something is just responding to stuff in the moment. They carry on. We want things that work over documentation. We want connections with customers rather than immovability. We want to be able to adapt to change rather than have a fixity of vision. So agility is nomadic. Agility is rhizomatic. We all know arborescent systems. Sorry about the white light. If anybody's gone blind, I apologize. We all know arborescent systems. Human systems are often arborescent. Banks, the state. Have you ever had to fill out a tax return? Get one number wrong in one column and you've got an audit next year that investigate everything. Organizations, probably the organizations you work for and with, very arborescent. Oh yes, there are many arborescent fixed systems that attempt to fix everything in space and time. And in case anybody doesn't recognize it, this is the SAFE diagram. And SAFE is a system which is somewhat more rigid than I would like from an agile system. So how can we be rhizomatic? How can we be nomadic? What tools can we take away from this sort of interesting but otherwise not very relevant tool? So let's think about what organizational thinking, change, and motivation looks like from the perspective of a becoming realism. I said we'd come back to Hotuan. Okay, thinking about organizations, this is actually an abandoned fishing village, and of course a village is an organization. Okay, so on the northern side of Shengshan Island, which is about 40 miles east of Shanghai, and until the early 1990s it housed about 2,000 fishermen. The problem was they couldn't get teachers and education to work properly, and food delivery wasn't adequate to support the population. Since then, it has been overtaken by greenery. I'm going to assume a lot of these are rhizomes for the sake of illustration. Probably some aren't, but it's a useful thought. It has utterly been transformed as part of a process of trees and plants just growing where they can, because we can see that there are trees in the background. The problem is that we see organization as fixed, independent, and identifiable, just the same as we think about other things. But actually, we shouldn't talk about an organization. We should talk about organization as the ongoing process. Change is constant. And the organization process is to arrest change and stop change. It's all sandbags all the time. Policy and procedure aims to minimize variation and to maintain control, as does hierarchy and striation and numbers and objectives. We go on courses to manage change, but if we relaxed control, change would happen anyway. Deleuze and Guattari say that there are 3 different types of lines in any organization and society. Now, this photo is called acceleration of a quantum wave. I have no idea what that means. I think it's made up, but it's a pretty picture and it's got some interesting stuff in it. So the first line is this. This is the rigid segmented line. It's molar, and molar means it operates on everybody as a collective. The molar lines are fixed by expectations in society, organizational norms. They maintain boundaries between things and around things. Man versus woman. Are you white? And if not, how white are you? Are you adult? And if not, how adult are you? Are you a manager? And if not, how managery are you? It also keeps us centered on activities. So in effect, at the center, we have the financial year, which keeps us in a constant circle and maintains control. And then there's also the linear space. For example, who works in an organization where the executive board have got their own space in a separate environment? The rigid segmented line keeps society organized, and it's the ongoing control of the system, the state, the organization. Then we have, can everybody see that little yellow line? It's a little wavy yellow line that goes around the red one. These are called the supple lines. They're molecular. They show constant variation and they act on individuals variously. Okay, so you've got these little wiggles. These are the rhizomatic lines. For example, the market value of your skills are these little wiggling lines. The product's value is the little wiggling lines. But it's also your ideas about self-worth, ideas about alternative movements that you could make. It's the micro acts and micro politics within an organization. How do people actually do the work? This is the natural tendency of change and agility. And then we have lines of flight. These are the opportunities that individuals have for new roles or moving to new organizations and for new products and new markets. The lines of flight are where you see innovation and creation. These lines remind us to think about the forces that act on teams. How can we enhance those forces or inhibit them to allow them to change? Which lines of flight might individuals or teams take? What segmentary lines are desirable and which aren't? How can we change those lines? Sorry, lines of flight just disappeared. What I would like to do is play a video. Now, we have had problems with this before. If this doesn't come across, I did actually have it copied and ready to go into chat. That's obviously not the situation right now. I'm going to press play. Hopefully this just works. Otherwise, I will play it till you can watch it later. This is about how we can find lines of flight. This is Oscar Mazareth, and he is in the free city of Danzig, which is the modern day Polish city of Gdansk. And I apologize for any pronunciation there that makes people cry. This is the 1940s. Danzig has been territorialized by the Nazis. That's a very polite way of saying invaded. And Oscar has his tin drum, Die Beichttrommel. Again, apologies to anybody who speaks better language than I. This is 4 minutes long, but it's worth it, so bear with me. You hear it, okay?
Was ist das für ein Freistaat, den man uns großzügig eingeräumt hat? Wie die Laus in den Pelz hat man uns die Polen ins Hafengebiet auf die Westerplatte gesetzt. Und mitten in unsere geliebte Altstadt hat man uns eine polnische Post beschert. Wir danken für diese Bescherung. Wir Deutschen hatten schon eine Post, als sich der Pole noch nichts in Briefen zu sagen hatte. Dem haben wir doch das Schreiben beigebracht. Doch nun, liebe Parteigenossen und Parteigenossinnen, wollen wir unseren Gast aus dem Reich, den uns der Führer geschickt hat, begrüßen. Soeben betritt der Parteigenosse Albert Forster das Kundgebungsgelände. Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil! Heil!
You note there the power of rhythm. The Nazi had a rhythm. It had an organizational rhythm. It was the sort that was hierarchalized. It was composed by a genius. It was played by musicians, controlled by the conductor. It had rhythm and it had refrains, patterns which repeated in it. But little Oscar came along and started playing a different rhythm. And it disrupted the original rhythm. And eventually it affected the original rhythm to the point that it completely subverted it. It's much more like jazz rhythms, which are improvisational. So no one person takes the lead. And by playing counter rhythms, we can subvert and change. The motivation to dance didn't need to be dangled. The desire to move and connect and be human already exists. Or should that be to become human? The rhythm itself unleashes that desire. You choose your systole and diastole, your contraction and your expansion, your rhythm and your refrains, and you use them to influence your organization. Agility is rhizomatic and nomadic. It is a transforming machine. There are lots of types of transforming machines, according to Deleuze and Guattari. There are the nomadic and rhizomatic transforming machines. The original ones were the nomadic stonemasons. They built cathedrals, castles, monasteries, and cities. They created becomings. This is where the first striations, the first lines on the earth are set down. Then there are the revolutionary movements. These are the becoming nomadics. They focus on opposing the dominant voice. Nobody becomes majoritarian. Caitlyn Jenner hasn't gained power by supporting Trump. But in fact, everybody needs to become minoritarian. Do you want to support women in your workplace? Becoming woman is how you do that. Not because you want to be a woman, but because being man doesn't and cannot help them. It is the becoming of everything by everybody. Guerrillas are the next obvious option there. Cell warfare. It's a limited form of war. It's what we're seeing in Ukraine. When space is occupied, nomads move in, free it, and then re-release it. There are other three types of transforming machines: the state war machine, the fascist war machine, and the global capitalist war machine. But they are all transforming engines. They are connecting desire and possibility. They are changing things from rhizomatic organizations into rigid organizations and backwards. Elle, I will answer your question in a second. I've got literally 2 slides, which isn't it's just I will fold back to it because I'm not sure which part you don't understand. I have a caution for you. Language is limiting. Language is the expression of the ideas of being. So thinking about becoming realism is a challenge to the way we think. There is an expectation that our words mirror reality, whereas in reality, our words shape the world and they shape the way we think. When we tell people information, and in fact, I've been doing this all night, when you make a statement of fact, you're actually giving people silent instructions. Before everything I have said tonight, you should have heard, you shall believe that, or let it be said, or everyone always says that. It creates an illusion of common language and common sense that can make the entire process of becoming human even more difficult. That's why I've had to use so much language and so many ideas to explain myself this evening. So my call for us tonight is to embrace the idea of becoming reality, to embrace processual thinking and to follow some of the ideas. Be like rhizomes, connect, be flexible, transform the free spaces inside the trees, pop up in unexpected places, use probe head experiments. Be nomads, know what works in practice, move freely, wander in between. Don't take the royal science of organisation for granted. Be jazz musicians, get people dancing, know how to use rhythm to change a situation. Focus on becoming. The journey is never over. These are just the start of my thoughts. This entire idea is the basis of my PhD. It's the conceptual basis for those who are interested in that sort of thing. This is the first time I put them in writing and presented them. Any questions?
El, you did say that you had a question there about no understanding something that they were saying. Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, please.
I just don't think I followed it was around the Caitlyn Jenner portion, and then you said something about everybody becoming minority. I didn't follow that.
Okay, so there's a common thing when we're talking about inequalities in society and oppression to think we should make the minorities more like the majorities so that they've got the same rights and power as the people who've got all the power, right? But actually that never works. So I was using Caitlyn Jenner as an example of someone who is in a minority. She's a trans woman and has chosen to side with the oppressor with a view to gaining power and influence. But actually becoming majoritarian doesn't work. You never become like the people who have got power. What you need to do instead is flip that and invert the concept. So instead of getting people to become majoritarian, in fact, you get the majority to become minoritarian. So you remove the majority altogether. So it's the idea of becoming woman, which isn't about being a trans woman. It's about accepting that being a man is not helping women at the moment. It's about accepting that being a white guy isn't helping black folks. It's about accepting that being straight isn't what's helping the gay folks. This becoming minoritarian allows us to completely change the power practices and the power dominance within that environment. Does that make more sense to you, El?
I'm going to have to really think about that one, David.
Feel free. It's like you can always ask me questions later, right? I think there's a lot in here that I've had to think about over an extended period of time. And I'm limited by language. It's not my fault. Shelby, I liked your comment. I think it was you, to send knotweed to your enemies. That's the only person who I saw say it. There's a potential problem there. First of all, it's an invasive species in this country, so that's technically illegal. But honestly, if you've managed to send it to your enemies and not contaminate your own garden, you've done better than most people do.
I don't think it was me, but we did have a conversation around knotweed and how dangerous it is. I think the comment came from the lovely Tim Robinson.
Yeah. So I worked for a company many years ago who actually provided garden de-infestation services. And honestly, it's a nightmare. Basically, you have to dig up the soil to a depth of 6 feet. You have to sieve it all and you have to incinerate everything. You can't get rid of it off-site. Very, very expensive. But perfect for your enemies, right? And cheaper than assassination.
Very much so.
David, this what you were talking about becoming a minoritarian. I'm just trying to extrapolate that to business context, and you're making a plea towards diversity and a lot of very different, supporting many different ways of doing things in order to find better ways. That is going to make a lot of people very, very corporations, businesses, anybody that seeks a structure and order is going to make people extremely uncomfortable. Yeah. I
mean, I think most of us are fairly experienced at feeling uncomfortable in our roles. I think when we challenge people's idea and thinking, that is very much what we do, if I'm honest with you. And if that's not the case and it's just me, I think my boss is actually on this call, so we can have a chat tomorrow about this. Becoming minoritarian in this case isn't always about ending oppression, but it can also be about changing ideas. Okay. And it's about identifying where the centers of power are and identifying ways of moving the power away from it. Okay. So this is about empowerment more broadly, and about empowerment of teams specifically in agility, and about empowerment of people who have got contact with the customers. So in an organization, those are very much minoritarian positions in a traditional organization, obviously. But it depends what your context is. Like, is finance the center of power? In which case, how can you give your small groups control over the financial process rather than having an annual cycle, which is managed by a central bureau, for example? But you're absolutely right. That's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, and it's not going to be easy.
I think the analogy of Caitlyn Jenner probably lost me, just because I obviously am American, but I also think I'm pretty conversant on what her views are. And she just genuinely, sincerely is a conservative, always has been. Yeah. And she always was trans. She just wasn't always open about it. So I think the analogy itself, like just probably lost me there.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. It's yeah, I mean, I can think of other examples, but I don't know that necessarily people would have come across them. And it was probably, I probably needed to think that one through. But any situation where the oppressed decide to side with the oppressor, they are not becoming majoritarian. They're not becoming that majority. They're not taking that power back. All they're doing is giving more power to the majority. It doesn't actually liberate anybody. It doesn't emancipate anybody. That's the point I'm trying to make. And if Caitlyn Jenner was a distraction, then throw that away and we'll blame language.
Mindful about the time. One final question, contributions. I'm gonna I will be editing the video because I'm gonna cut that middle part, but I think that the closing summary that you did there at the end, I think I want to cut that off and make it up, not remove it, but that final statement, there was a lot of really, really interesting stuff, and just that final minute, I want to revisit it again.
I like the idea that the final minute was worth everything that came up to it.
It leads to this. It leads to it as well. I mean, it wouldn't contextually. I mean, I don't want to remove it from context, but personally, I want to revisit that specific part. But there was a lot of very interesting things in what you did.
The problem for me was, how do I get to the end of that and give you that without all the stuff that comes before it? Like, I'd like to say thank you actually to Gabrielle, who's on the call. Thanks, Gabrielle, who went through version 1 of this, which I think she will agree looks nothing like this.
Yeah, it's very different, but it's good. It's a good difference. I like, it's kind of amazing actually that you did that in less than a day and probably didn't have much time to practice it. But yeah, you know, there's so many useful things to unpack in this.
As we usually say, with excellent title and followed up by an excellent talk. Thank you very much, David.